Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Today, we are joined by Dr. Takuya Matsuda, who will be presenting on Camp David Summit and the US, Japan, South Korea Trilateral Security Relations. Dr. Takuya Matsuda holds a PhD from the War Studies Department at King's College London. He is a Grand Strategy in Asia Research Fellow at the Yokosuka Council on Asia-Pacific Studies, which is known as YCAPS, and his research focuses primarily on alliance politics, great power relations, international relations theories, and the U.S. Grand Strategy. Dr. Matsuda, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. I'll let you take it from here.
Right. Thank you, Imani, for a kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm sure you're all tuning in globally from around the world. So without further ado, let me share you my slides, and let's get started. All right. All right. So does anyone see my slide? Yeah, I think it's still teaching. Here we go. So today I'll be talking about Camp David Summit that took place last month and its significance to the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral relations. This is a very timely topic, but this is something that has been discussed out there in both the academy and also in policy circles. And I'll sort of unpack why this is important and what it means for Japan throughout this presentation. So let me just first walk you through what the seminar does. So as I mentioned a moment ago, it will illustrate the significance of the summit, why it matters, and then it will highlight what it means for the entire, the regional security order here in the region, and also specifically on Japan defense policy, since we're here to all learn about Japan. And I'll also touch a little bit upon what broader implications of this to alliance politics and to U.S. foreign policy in general. So basically, when you talk about Japan and South Korea, like history and all that comes into play, and obviously they are part of the picture here. So I'll touch upon the role of historical disputes in international relations. I will not go into details of like specific issues that Japan and South Korea has over history. We're going to talk about more specifically on alliance politics, security stuff. So that's one sort of like disclaimer I just want to put out there before we start. So this is like the outline of my presentation. So I'll start by looking at what we saw last month, the overview of Camp David Summit, and sort of give you a background of, Japan and South Korea's relations in the past 10 years. And later on, I'll probably a little bit dive into alliance politics. It might sound a little bit pedantic here, but it's very important to understand what, this all means and why it's important. So I'll touch a little bit on alliance politics. It might be a little bit theoretical here for this series, but please bear with me, and then I'll sort of zoom out to give you the full picture of what this means for regional security, Japan's defense policy, and U.S. foreign policy. So let me first give you the overview of the Camp David Summit that took place last month among the three leaders from Japan, the United States, and South Korea. So the spirit of Camp David. If I were to give you an elevator pitch of what this means, it basically institutionalizes trilateral relations among the three countries, for unity and coordinated action. So the institutionalizing, trilateral relations is basically the main takeaway of the Camp David Summit. And as this picture in the background shows you, the commitment to consult is one of the major points that the three leaders agreed upon at Camp David. So what it does is it underscores that the three governments commit to consulting with each other to coordinate responses to regional challenges, provocations, and threats that affect their collective interests and security. So it's about it basically highlights the importance to get together, talk about the issues without being distracted by the political issues. So this commitment to consult is one of the key pillars of the Camp David Summit and what they agreed upon. And what do we mean by institutionalized security coordination? So, for example, it involves enhanced trilateral defense exercises, improved information sharing. I'll touch upon this later, which is called GSOMIA. Japan and South Korea launched a military joint military intelligence sharing agreement in 2016, which was also, there was ups and downs on that, and increased cooperation on ballistic missile defense. So this is also something significant since China has been pressuring South Korea intensively for South Korea from actually joining a missile defense or architecture with the U.S. and Japan. This is also something significant. But to see how there's a lot of efforts made here to align messages and coordinate response actions, and to, most important, to institutionalize security coordination that happens among the three nations, but particularly, most importantly, between Japan and South Korea. So actually, this didn't just happen abruptly. Actually, this builds on the Japan-South Korea summit that happened in March. So in the summit between Japan and South Korea, maybe some of you remember how President Yoon from South Korea and Prime Minister Kishida of Japan, they had like a nice sort of beer after dinner beer in Ginza. So during that summit, the two countries articulated a resumption of shuttle diplomacy, which means that two leaders from both countries meet each other on a regular basis, and also, most importantly, normalization of GSOMIA, which is something I'll touch upon later. But the military intelligence sharing agreement between the two countries that has been one of the starting points of closer security ties between the two nations since the 2010s. So let me explain to you, why, the background of Japan-South Korea relations in the past 10 years. Like this seems like, Japan and South Korea, two U.S. allies, it seems kind of natural that they're kind of, getting along. But if you look at the past 10 years, you can see how this is kind of, this was kind of the unthinkable that was happening, in last month in Camp David. So actually, when it comes to Japan-South Korea relations, since the Obama administration, the United States has actually proactively sought to facilitate closer security ties among U.S. allies in this region. So it might have come from a more burden sharing perspective. About the Obama administration didn't want to, wanted to keep their strategic solvency, which means that they didn't want to spend too much in national defense. So there was a burden sharing aspect to that, but still, since the Obama administration, facilitating Japan-South Korean security relations was something that they have been striving to achieve. So there are actually some examples of these efforts. So the 2015 agreement to resolve the conflict limit issue, which is something that Prime Minister Kishida himself signed when he was a foreign minister back then under the Abe administration, is one attempt to resolve some of the the contentious issues between the two countries. And also 2016 General Security of Military Information Agreement, which is basically a military intelligence sharing agreement between Japan and South Korea, which is also known as GSOMIA. The signing of this also shows how there's some effort, actually significant effort, being made to facilitate closer security ties between Japan and South Korea, actually in the past 10 years. However, as you may recall, there are a lot of historical issues between Japan and South Korea. Japan's imperial past in South Korea obviously has some to talk about obvious grievances, disagreements with Japan. And as a culmination of that, in summer 2019, Seoul threatened to withdraw from GSOMIA. As a culmination of all these intensifying political tensions with Tokyo, you can see how just 4 years ago, Japan and South Korean relations was actually at a very bad stage where talking about security cooperation was still was something that was not, almost like unfeasible back then. So back then, when Seoul threatened to withdraw from GSOMIA just 4 years ago, then Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Randall Shriver articulated strong concerns and disappointment against these acts from the South Korean side, and urged the two nations to engage in a meaningful dialogue to insulate security matters from other political disputes. So this was some frustrating situation for the United States, where historical disputes between Japan and South Korea, political issues has constantly derailed the U.S. efforts to foster closer security relations between Japan and South Korea. And I'll also add that the fact that Beijing's intense pressure on Seoul not to join a U.S.-Japan missile defense architecture, like I think a lot of you members thought, and how that was controversial in Seoul, in South Korea, and how Beijing was working hard to sabotage those efforts. This was also a significant hurdle as well. So let me sort of like give a framework of why this is the case. Why cannot Japan and South Korea just get along? So that's why I say like strategic orientation versus historical disputes. Like, how do these two factors interact with each other? So, if you actually observe East Asia, like, a lot of people would argue that in a history here, especially in the early half of the 20th century, obviously the countries here, Japan, South Korea, and China, they don't get along for obvious reasons. Well, that might be sort of, somewhat true. Also, like right now, China is actually, criticizing Japan for the Fukushima issues. Um, and that might be, that is assumption people have. But actually, if you look at history, strategic interests often trump historical grievances. So if you look at Sino-Japanese relations in the 1980s, actually, over the Senkaku Islands, Xi Jinping actually, sorry, apologies for that. Deng Xiaoping back then argued that, given the fact that the Soviet Union was a, was shared threat for Japan and China, Deng Xiaoping argued that, we agree to disagree. We have these issues over these islands, but there are a lot more important things that we should consider, and these small issues should not derail our friendship. So that's when you think about Sino-Japanese relations right now. That's a really interesting sort of comment that was made from China's president basically 40 years ago. And also, if you look back at 1965 normalization of diplomatic ties between Japan and South Korea, I won't get too much details into that, but this is also a case where during the Cold War, the United States wanted to, facilitate South Korea's economic development, and the treaty, and also the foreign financial aid from Japan and South Korea, normalized trade relations between Japan and South Korea are supposed to sort of facilitate those strategic interests during the Cold War. So when you have like these strategic interests, like historical grievances are often put aside in the past. So in other words, when you look at the 2010s, from the Seoul's perspective, closest security ties with Japan and also the United States was not seen as desirable nor necessary, from Seoul's perspective. That's the reason that these historical grievances actually were more, surface, and and these strategic interests were not necessarily considered. That was also one of the hurdles between close security ties between the two countries. And when you look at East Asia, we have to think about like how strategic orientation in different countries are different, because in East Asia, large bodies of water separate all these major powers in the region. So that kind of brought peace for a very long time. If you have like water that offers distance among different countries, it's hard to invade each other. Like they kind of put in peace, because guys are all separated apart. But that also means that in East Asia, like different countries have different strategic orientations. So Japan and South Korea are both US allies, share values, but when it comes to the strategic priorities these countries have, they're actually very different. So Japan, it's an archipelago state, it's a maritime power. Japan's maritime power has been, articulated in many security documents, national defense strategies, security strategy in this country. Whereas South Korea, it does rely on sea lanes and communications, but it's also a continental power. Like when it comes to like, South Korea's number one threat is going to be North Korea. Like, Seoul is just it's very close to the border with North Korea. So South Korea is basically a continental power when you think about it. So like South Korea being a continental power, Japan being a maritime power, it was very hard to align these strategic priorities between the two countries. However, in recent years, South Korea also started to shift their outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, towards the seas. So President Yoon actually, articulates a vision of South Korea being a global pivotal state that contributes to, the so-called Indo-Pacific, free and open, inclusive Indo-Pacific, which he argued in the Foreign Affairs magazine. So he has actually particularly emphasized and underscored in different writings and speeches how he prioritized the importance of South Korea's alliance relationship with the United States, and also especially trilateral security cooperation, including with Japan. So you can see how the different strategic orientations between the two countries was a hurdle because it was hard for Seoul and Tokyo to align their strategic priorities. But Seoul's strategic interests are actually shifting more towards in the Pacific, to the broader maritime space, and that is something that kind of started to bring these two countries together. Even though it is true that still South Korea's primary focus is North Korea, but when you think about it, South Korea also is a peninsula, which is like half an island. So South Korea does rely heavily on the sea lines and communication. The tankers come from the Middle East. All these trade, natural resources come from the sea. And when you look at a map, like if there's a blockade over Taiwan, for example, like that will also heavily impact South Korea when it comes to their economic activities, trade, and also long-term survival as a state. So in order to, as the two countries, as the strategic interest priorities between Japan and South Korea start to align, there were a lot of significant efforts that were made to resolve disputes over the wartime laborers, which President Yoon worked hard to resolve. As the historical issues have been sort of like dealt with, that kind of paved the way for Japan and South Korea to have close security relations between each other. And also, like, when it comes to, there's always, when I talk about these things, like, you always say the why question, right? Why now? Is this because of China? And, when it comes to, is it because of China? The question, it's kind of a yes and no. Let me just unpack what I mean by that. So, when you look at, let's just sort of shift our, focus a little bit to Europe for a moment. So when you look at Finland and Sweden's accession to NATO, which has long been unthinkable. By the way, these two countries used to be a neutral state, just like Japan's pacific constitution. So Japan is not a neutral state, but they had this similar national sort of pride in their neutrality. So when it comes to these two Nordic states joining NATO, that was unthinkable for a very long time, given their national identity. So that became reality after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And actually, this is a picture. The picture you see on the right is a Russian tank that was destroyed in the outskirts of Kyiv in March 2022. This was displayed in the city square of the capital city of Lithuania, which I took in like this March. But you can see, if you look at the Baltic states, Nordic states, and you see how these countries are actually reacting and actually signing to treat alliances that was the unthinkable for throughout since the Cold War. So you can see how if a aggressive revisionist state starts a war, does make some sort of moves, that will actually lead to surrounding countries to sort of do the unthinkable and also get together for their own security. So in parallel, when you think about China's recent assertiveness in the region, all this thing that we see between Japan and South Korea could be it could see it as a parallel with what we've seen in Europe in the past year. It was unthinkable for a very long time for Japan and South Korea to get together and talk about security issues, but that's actually happening right here. And also this is a bit of a international relations theory type of argument. But if there's a assertive country, that country ends up self-encircling itself. So other regional states will actually get together, and the assertive country will be encircled by those countries in this region. The quadrilateral security relationship between U.S., Japan, India, and Australia is one example. There's a lot of multilaterals like popping up in the region, and that's also reaction to China's assertiveness, which would be called as a form of self-encirclement by China. And yes, indeed, this is that's basically one of the reasons that this is happening. But just looking at this as a force multiplier, just these two different countries with shared threats coming together. Actually, it's true to a certain degree, but it actually overlooks the reason the summit was actually crucial and important for regional security. So the question that deserves our attention here is how this new trilateral relationship could be actually operationalized, and so what does this entail? That's the question I'll be exploring a little bit in the upcoming slides. So this is a bit of a it's not a university lecture here, but let me talk a little bit about what is alliances, what are alliance politics, to give you a sort of a background to understand these events. So definition is very important. Alliances are actually military alliances that are defined as a form of commitment for security cooperation between two or more states. So basically, alliances are basically often a written down sort of contract that if your country is in danger, we'll come help you. It's a contract. It's not just a friendship sort of thing. It's a very strong commitment when it comes to military alliances. That's also something I wanted to bear in mind, because that's also going to be important in the discussion later on. And also, when it comes to alliance politics, we have this assumption that, I'm sure a lot of you heard of the word balance of power, but we assume that, alliances are based, are about aggregation of capabilities. Like, you just aggregate different, countries' capabilities to sort of have, more power. And that's kind of the assumption we have in the literature and also more in the popular sort of writings. The balance of power is a very well-known word if you're someone informed, well-informed in international relations. But that those all assume that aggregation capability occurs naturally, and that is the baseline assumption of alliances. But actually, when you think about it, alliances are a collection of different states, right? So when you think about group projects you've done in school, like not having a lot of group members in your project doesn't necessarily enhance the effectiveness or the productivity of the whole group. So these are two or more different states coming together, which means that there's a lot of hurdles when it comes to enhancing military effectiveness, like creating common power among different countries. As we look at Japan and South Korea, we have to think about aligning strategic priorities, also command structure. Having a joint command structure is really going to be important. When we think about aggregation of capabilities, still what happens if you have duplication of capabilities? That's going to make things less productive, right? Less productive. But when it comes to actually facilitating security arrangements between countries, you have to have some sort of mechanisms, coordination per se. So as Dr. Paul Post, Professor Paul Post from University of Chicago described in his book in 2019, alliances could be conceptualized as being based on a compatible joint war plan. So you need to have these sort of aligned priorities, strategic priorities, and also you have to then think about the ends and means and ways to achieve that strategic ends. So and also once you have those aligned strategic priorities which Japan and South Korea have long had trouble aligning with each other, there's also then the next step will be having this coordination mechanism or a division of labor among allies to actually operationalize the two and actually effectively use the contribution of these two countries. Like the Anglo-American alliance during World War II is a great example. The U.S. and the U.K., the British had different theaters they took care of. Division of labor between these two allies actually did work effectively. When it comes to alliance politics, you're in a team, but you have to then think about division of labor. When you look at sports and all, that's really a very natural, intuitive thing, but we don't really think that way somehow when we think about alliance politics or in international relations. But this coordination mechanism or of division of labor is going to be very crucial when you have different countries, especially with different countries that has different strategic priorities and also different capabilities. So in overall, you can see how this, as we discussed earlier, the Camp David Summit actually is paving the way for an institutionalized security relationship between Japan and South Korea and also the U.S. But see how these sort of things we talked about here on alliance politics in the slide is actually being sort of realized through these discussions. And also, it's also worth mentioning how alliance politics is shifting more from mere burden sharing, which is more about the political costs or entailed from defense budgets and all that, to actually producing military power. So there's a huge shift in the way we see alliances that could be sort of observed through the trilateral security relations. So that was a bit of the basic sort of kind of a small lecture on alliance politics. When we sort of shift back to and applying this to the trilateral security cooperation, you can see how the main objective of Camp David and also main significance of this is the institutionalization of security coordination. That's the key pillar of any steering arrangement for that to effectively function when something bad happens in the region. And also the fact that Japan and South Korea, when you look at the reason Japan and South Korea had trouble getting together to talk about security matters, actually tells you a lot about why these coordination, like institutionalization of security coordination, is very crucial. Like as we discussed earlier, Japan and South Korea has different strategic priorities. South Korea prioritizing North Korea for obvious reasons, Japan being a maritime power. These differences were there, and it still exists, right? Geography hasn't changed. So for South Korea, they have more of a strategic interest in the Pacific, being more in the maritime space, but still North Korea is not going to go away anywhere. Like you can see how so it's always important to so the strategic difference in the strategic orientation between Japan and South Korea, it has not disappeared, which means that this coordination will be crucial going forward, though it seems like things are actually going smoothly on the surface. And also when you think about it, the reason trilateral strategic coordination between the three countries is important is because when you think about several great power wars in East Asia, we all talk about Taiwan contingency these days, but these great wars happened and involved the Korean Peninsula. When there are multiple examples here, right? The Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, these were fought over the Korean Peninsula. The Korean War is one of the consequential wars that define, in the initial phase of the Cold War. So all these great power wars in the region were actually fought in the Korean Peninsula. When you think about it, when you think about region-wide conflict that could occur, hopefully not, but could occur in the region, hypothetically, think about bringing South Korea into the picture of these security arrangements is going to be very crucial. And also, this is also another important point that actually does touch upon Japan's defense policy. So Japan's long-range counter-strike capabilities is going to be, it actually does assume Chinese or North Korean missiles. But when you think about North Korean missiles, for example, if Japan shoots down or attacks the North Korean missile base, what happened? The consequences will be not only come to Japan, it will be also consequential for South Korea and U.S. armed forces in Korea as well. To see how Japan actually acquiring these, new capabilities actually makes it even more urgent for Japan to have some sort of, let's say, commitment to consult or some sort of constellation mechanism with South Korea. Because when it comes to missile defense, and if it involves North Korea into the picture, we need to really talk with, Japan needs to talk with South Korea about these things. So when it comes to Japan acquiring these new capabilities, the coordination mechanism between Japan, Tokyo, and Seoul over missile defense, it's not a joint command structure, but something, that a constellation mechanism, for example, is going to be very effective and important for effective implementation of Japan acquiring these long-range counter-strike capabilities. And also, specialization respect capabilities between Japan and South Korea, that's going to be very crucial. And also that will be important ways to enhance combined military power among the three countries. And also, when you think about alliance policy more in a more general, for a more general sense, this unity among U.S. allies make coercive diplomacy very ineffective. So China and Russia has always been trying to drive a wedge between Japan and South Korea. If you have these, self-encirclement, you want to drive wedges among your opponents, right? That's been what China has been doing that towards Japan and South Korea since 2019. And we talked about GSOMIA earlier, and Japan and South Korea having the strategic priorities and interests aligned. At least being on the same page, it's going to be extremely important for cooperative diplomacy and managing great power competition. So when it comes to trilateral arrangement here, it's very difficult for that to become a formal multilateral alliance like NATO. Like I mentioned earlier about alliance politics, it's a huge commitment. It's like a contract that we'll defend each other. So this Japan-South Korea trilateral security relationship, it's very hard to step that up towards upgrading that towards an alliance because of those reasons, what alliances actually are. Still, when it comes to its emphasis on consultation, like coordination, that's an important step forward to cement security ties between the two countries. And it's sort of an alliance per se, for the reasons I mentioned earlier about alliance politics, but the institutionalization of security coordination is also something that is important, significant, that is a main takeaway from the Camp David Summit. So let me just wrap up quickly about about this presentation. So what the summit means for regional security. So as I mentioned earlier, the Trilateral Summit is arguably a product of Beijing's self-encirclement, and which enabled the unthinkable just 4 years ago when South Korea withdrew from GSOMIA. But that happened, right? So it's also the China factor, as people observers tend to say, is true. But it's also important to bear in mind there are unique obstacles between Japan and South Korea that made it difficult for these two countries to align their strategic interests, and those challenges remain. So that's the reason that, the fact that the summit facilitated institutionalization of security coordination among US, Japan, South Korea is very important, to actually acknowledge the differences, the different strategic priorities among the three countries, and also come up with a way to sort of, consult with each other, stay on the same page, align strategic priorities, and also think about division of labor among each three countries. That's going to be very crucial going forward. And that's exactly what the summit aimed to do. And also in respect to Japan's defense policy, Japan's acquisition of counter-strike capabilities actually make it even more crucial to actually have a coordinating mechanism with South Korea. Because as I mentioned earlier, if it's going to target North Korea, for example, then it will have serious consequences for South Korea and US forces in Korea, which means that some sort of consultation or mechanism to talk and to make sure we are on the same page is going to be crucial, given the fact that Japan is actually proactively stepping up, acquiring new capabilities. So when it comes to let me just zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about US foreign policy. So the summit actually illuminates how the U.S. alliance system is actually shifting from just as a means to project power, or it's actually shifting more towards a platform to produce military power as a response to great power competition. So a lot of discussions on alliance politics in the past 10 years has been often about burden sharing, about the cost that these commitments impose upon the U.S. But this, as the summit sort of shows how the institutionalization of security coordination is important in actually creating military power in an age of great power competition. You can see how, when it comes to alliance politics in general, you can see a huge shift that's going on in the way that we all see alliances and their role in international relations. That's something that's observable in the summit as well. So let me just stop here and thank you for your kind attention. And I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matsuda, for your presentation today. It was really, really interesting. So to begin the Q&A session, I want to know, in terms of South Korea, so South Korea is in a bit of a situation where they depend on their trade relationship with China, and additionally, they depend perhaps on the security relationship with the United States. So in terms of South Korea's current president or Prime Minister Yoon, he has a bit of a softer approach, I guess, to North Korea. How can South Korea deal with, I guess, all of these things going on with regards to the security relations between themselves, the United States, and Japan?
That's actually a very good question. So I'm not it might be a right time to introduce a couple of writings I did with my South Korean colleague on Warner Rock. So he's more of an expert on South Korean politics. So if you look at, maybe it's shared on the chat. If you have a look, could you have a look at the 2019 article that we wrote? It actually does outline South Korea's dilemma here, where they have to consider relationship with China, but also they are a U.S. ally, and when it comes to security guarantees, it comes from the U.S. and also from Japan to a certain degree, U.S. forces in Japan. So that dilemma has always been an issue for South Korea. So that's why you can see this fluctuation in South Korean politics from the liberals tend to be more soft on North Korea and more maybe not anti-U.S. Japan, but you can see how they are more looking towards the North. But President Yoon is a conservative politician, and he's actually looking more towards the U.S.-Japan alliance and the U.S. So more towards the sea per se, right? So a little bit away from North Korea. So these dynamics do shape South Korean politics, and I'm not myself a South Korean. I'm not expert in South Korean politics, so maybe the article I share with you will probably give you more insights, but it is true that a lot of countries, also even in Southeast Asia, this is for a lot of countries in the region, China being an economic partner, U.S. being a security guarantor, has been a dilemma, for a lot of Southeast Asian countries and also for South Korea, because as I mentioned earlier, South Korea is a peninsula, right? So which means that it's both an island and a continental power. So that dilemma has been there. And so basically, if you look at South Korean politics, President Yoon is not necessarily the most popular president out there. His outreach to Japan is not necessarily seen as favorable among the public. So a lot of observers of South Korean politics argue what they do suspect whether this is going to be a sustainable trend for South Korea to actually have some close security ties with Japan, and that's why institutionalizing these coordination is really going to be important going forward. But that's a very good question. But maybe the article that might be having shared in chat might have a better answer from my South Korean colleague, Dr. Jae-Han Park. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So moving on to the chat, Lin Ha asks, according to the Lowy Institute, Japan and South Korea are categorized as middle powers. In your opinion, how does this categorization reflect their diplomatic approaches in dealing with the ongoing competition between the United States and China in reality? Thank you.
That's another really important and interesting question. Like defining what is a middle power is very difficult. So Japan has been a great power, in the region, but it's true that its economic clout and all that has been sort of diminishing in the past couple of years. It's hard to sort of actually define whether it's a great power or middle power. That's going to be a bit of a pedantic sort of discussion here. But one thing I can say is that for but let's say Japan was actually clear from 1945 to align with the US because Japan is a sea power, right? So Japan, many sea powers tend to align with the larger sea power. So for Japan, after 1945, it was very clear there were a lot of discussion within when it comes to domestic politics in Japan. When it comes as a state, like when it comes to alignment, aligning with the sea power is very crucial. And also there, talks about Japan hedging, Japan's updated security policy might be hedging strategy towards US. That's that's a discussion we hear here and there in Japan. But in general, Japan, the choice is very clear. Like, if you're a maritime power, aligning with the US is very, it's a very rational and very straightforward choice. But, I'm not sure if it actually answers your question on the middle power question, but it actually does relate to the question that Mani asked earlier. But for South Korea, being, both a land and maritime power has been difficult for them to maneuver through these different, powers in the region. And also many Southeast Asian countries have the same issue. It's also the economy versus security dilemma, but also, for Vietnam, for example, also has this land power, being land power, sharing a border with China, and also, relying on, sea lanes and communication, is also done for country like Vietnam, which is both land power and sea power. So that is a dilemma that a lot of countries share in Southeast Asia as well, and also South Korea. But I'm not sure if I'm asking a question right here, but for Japan, it's probably a more straightforward answer who to align is with, at least as long as the U.S. naval power is, the U.S. has some naval primacy in the region.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Randy Stolz. I'm from Idaho, who we have two senators in our history who have chaired Senate Foreign Relations. Church was an internationalist in outlook, and Bora was an isolationist. Since Trump, isolationists seem to be in ascendance. Yet to me, we are in the most dangerous period in international relations since the end of the Cold War. How do we combat isolationism, which is the most fashionable, and that has been in the last 30 years, or since the 30s, I'm sorry.
That's actually a really excellent question because, okay, let me answer this in a couple parts. So when it comes to the past 10 years, we see President Trump as the isolationist that kind of changed the game. But actually, it actually started since the Obama administration to focus more on, domestic economy. So President Obama was trying to, withdraw troops. He actually did withdraw troops from Iraq and also from Afghanistan. He wanted to leave Afghanistan actually, and he was trying to, restore strategic solvency, reduce, defense, the cost of, defense commitments. And that's also the reason he thought that alliances are a way to sort of, reduce the costs for security for the United States. And he's the one who actually, argued, nation building starts at home, right? So this trend of focusing more on, domestic economy and the issues we have back home in the U.S., that's been a trend for the past 10 years, which is very, this is a very natural trend, right? And when it comes for the voters and taxpayers, what matters is whether you have bread and butter on your table, a dinner table, not about a foreign country that you've never been to and their security. And And that's a trend that we have to deal with. That's an excellent question, because that's also a discussion a lot of like policymakers and like strategists think about. We actually living in an age of great power competition. U.S. military dominance is no longer an assumption that we can hold. But at the same time, we actually have to think about demands of austerity. We have to think about domestic economy. We just can't spend or try to outspend our opponents, right? And it could be a generational competition. So that's a really tough question, and that a lot of the policymakers, not only in the U.S. actually, also in Japan, will have to face, especially for Japan. There's an Asian population here, but when it comes to ways to combat these trends, this is a very important question. But American policymakers have been grappling with this since like the end of World War II. Actually, we assume that U.S. has been a global power since 1945, but that's not the case. Like selling the Marshall Plan, which actually facilitated economic reconstruction in Europe, it was a very tough sell to the American public, because we had this great war in Europe and the Pacific. Your loved ones are coming back home, and then going back to Europe, that was a very tough sell for to the American public. So when it comes, that's the reason that policymakers try to create a narrative to justify why this is important for the United States, why it's important for U.S. national interest, and that's the reason that even for President Biden, who is portraying himself as an internationalist president, he actually does have to talk about a foreign policy for the middle class, because you cannot ignore the domestic economy. So when it comes we have to come up with a narrative to sort of to maybe not justify is not the right word, but to sell these commitments to deal with great power competition to the American public. And one thing I'll add here is that it's really hard when you sell these things. Like you tend to get into the authoritarianism versus democracy, or if you've got the Pacific War, it can even become a racial sort of categorization, which is very unhealthy here. So it's really hard to figure out what's the right way to create that narrative to sort of promote the internationalist, or at least somewhat international looking foreign policy. But that's a really tough question we all talk about, and that's an excellent question, and I hope I answered your question, but thank you.
Thank you so much. The next question comes from Ryan. Asked, can you develop on how South Korea is a continental power? Or it seems odd for a country that's not very wide.
Right. When it comes when I say continental power, I mentioned their their capabilities, their focus when it comes to their national defense. So they rely on sea lines and communications, but they have not invested too much on naval power, and their strategic outlook focus has been on North Korea for very obvious reasons. So that's the reason I categorize them as a continental power, because they have been focusing more towards North Korea, because that's you share borders with North Korea, and that's a pretty obvious threat, and that's a really totally different strategic surrounding environment compared to Japan. So you can see how that's why there's differences in strategic priorities between Japan and South Korea. Thank you.
The next question comes from Georgie M. So was the mentioned trilateral summit caused by the changing of the security status quo in Europe and getting Russia closer to North Korea, or was it to reinforce security guarantees for South Korea due to Japan adopting a new security policy or new security policies?
Right, that's another great question. So when it comes to Russia and North Korea, there was a summit between Kim Jong-un and President Putin. So that's but when it comes to Russia, when it comes to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, that has been a catalyst for many, even for Japan, right? As that these sort of interstate war could actually happen in 2023, 2022. So that has probably been one of the triggers per se. It's like the Korean War and how that led to cementing all the consolidation of all these alliance structures, because that was actually the trigger. Actually, the Korean War was a trigger for all these alliance structures to actually be consolidated. So in a way, the war in Ukraine is sort of a similar trigger as you mentioned Russia, but for South Korea's perspective, I think it's also about China as well, and also I'm not sure if Japan's upgraded security policy, encouraged South Korea to reach out to Japan, but what I can say here is that Japan's upgraded capabilities does will have some consequences in this region, especially the counter-strike capabilities. So Japan's upgraded security policy has made it even more important for the security coordinations to happen, because without those, like even without having platforms like actually discuss and have some sort of arrangement with each other, like that could really lead to unintended consequences. So Japan's upgraded security strategy was not necessarily a trigger, but it actually made it even important for these mechanisms to emerge going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Hiroyuki Takahashi. Hello, some Japanese statesmen still have strong intentions to visit Yasukuni Shrine in August. To what extent do you think these kinds of potential historical issues of Japan would affect the trilateral relation?
That's another important question. It's I think we need to insulate these personal opinions, personal political opinions with the broader security landscape, right? So like I think and for a lot of policymakers in Japan, that was a very hard distinction to make. Like, so when Prime Minister Abe visited Yasukuni earlier in his tenure as a prime minister, he had a really strong reaction from the U.S. Embassy here in Japan. You're using the word disappointment, right? That's when he realized that this is a red line that cannot be crossed, and that because also obviously, politicians have their own personal opinions. That's totally fine, but just that when it comes to but it's actually unhelpful and unconstructive if you actually unproductive if you actually do something that will definitely trigger or make the other opponent frustrated or angry. Like that's you don't need to necessarily do that intentionally. And I think some Japanese politicians didn't understand the consequences of what this might entail for their security or foreign policy arrangements with other countries. But that sort of literacy or understanding towards that has sort of been more, there's better understanding among Japanese politicians on, what specific sort of, actions might, what consequence that might have in their foreign policy. So I think, not sure how that's, the Yasukuni Shrine thing will, who will actually visit Yasukuni or that, but I'd argue that sort of there's more. I hope there's more understanding among Japanese politicians about the consequences of that, and also it's true that as a state or a political leader, it's important to actually I actually mentioned then Assistant Secretary of Defense Randall Schreiber's comments, but it's important to insulate political disagreements, political opinions from the broader security agendas we have that are crucial for our respective state security. So. That's how I'll probably answer that question. I hope I answered your question right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Randy Stolz. Given the historical grounds for distrust between Korea and Japan, how do we keep this fragile multilateralism? India, Australia, and the Philippines relationship must be accounted for because of South China Sea. How do we keep this figuratively speaking, baby from being stillborn?
Right, that's another very important, and it's actually a harder question for all these multilaterals that's popping up, right? Even the Quad, right? So basically, the only thing we can do is institutionalize it and make sure that the free countries understand why this is important, necessary, and this is something I actually mentioned in some of the slides here. But that's probably the only way to sort of keep this going forward. Institutionalized alliances are very often tend to be stable because it's a signed contract, right? And I won't see this trilateral relationship turning into an alliance, because given how alliance is a very strong commitment, but institutionalizing these coordinations to a certain degree does sort of lock you into that relationship. So even if there's a fluctuation in Japan or South Korean politics where that might sort of make the relationship a little bit more unstable, the arrangement needs to be kept there, right? Because also these arrangements are necessary in case something happens in the region that affects all three countries' security. So it's nice. It's like an insurance, like having security arrangements and alliances. You will not appreciate it until you lose it. And given the security environment here, it's nice to at least have that arrangement. And the only way to do this is probably to lock these countries in, maybe not alliance, but at least institutionalize it and make sure that you have these shared so strategic priorities per se, and have an understanding why it's important. It's not just a club just talking and like dining and whining, right? It's actually vital importance to this trilateral summit, as I mentioned in the presentation. Like it's just reinforcing why it's important, and that's probably the reason they call it a commitment to consult, given the challenges and also like the importance of this. So that's probably the only way to go forward. But that's a very important point when it comes to the quad trilateral between Japan and South Korea, Japan and the Philippines, the U.S. It's something that it's making these things, these arrangements stable is something that policymakers and scholars have to think about going forward. Thank you for your question.
So it seems like every time there's an election in Japan and South Korea, the issues between both countries due to the past, it seems like the wound is constantly reopened.
Right.
So the next question by Mark Su asks, what how can Japan and South Korea prevent their relationships from being ruined by the next politicians who are elected into office in both countries?
That's a really, I mean, it's just that it's a very hard question, but it's actually, in a way, it might be kind of simple because, as I mentioned in the slides, like when you see this dichotomy between strategic interests and historical disputes, it's always a fluctuation in this region, right? Like when it comes to Deng Xiaoping in the 80s and late 70s, 80s, she said like we agreed to disagree. The Senkakus, we don't really care. There are a lot more important issues to talk about. And you can see how these things fluctuate based on strategic environment. So when you think about it, it's just that when it comes to these political disputes, it's very hard to resolve them. Like it's about their national pride and history. Each country have their own ways to see history, and it's not a right or wrong question, right? So these are things that are hard to overcome, and it's just that these things tend to fluctuate, unfortunately. So I won't go too deep into the respective issues that Japan and South Korea has, whether it's like true or right or wrong. But one thing I can tell you from a security studies perspective is that it's important to sort of distinguish these historical political grievances that you might have from your own political standpoint and what is important in terms of like national security. We have to like insulate these two things when you think about both your foreign policy and domestic policy. I think the reason I quoted the Secretary Shriver's speech in 2019 when South Korea threatened to withdraw from Newtonian is that that's actually a spirit that we all need to have. Like we have differences, we have disagreements, but we need to insulate that from the bigger agenda that we have here, especially in Asia Great Power competition. It's really hard to do that. It's easier said than done, but I think that's that quote is probably the spirit of going forward, trying to overcome these differences, and I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
And the final question comes from Minhua Jiang. Says, thank you for your insightful presentation. You earlier elaborated how Seoul did not see closer security ties with Japan as necessary back in the 2010s. And I'm curious how Japan at the time saw this. Did Japan feel the need to make this the tie? And also, how is Japan currently perceiving its bilateral security ties with Korea? Would the two countries cooperate with one another without the U.S. in the middle?
Those are also very good questions, actually. I think for Japan, I was not actually based in Japan in 2010. So based on my, what I kind of learned from reading news and all that, I think even for Japan's perspective, I think in 2010, I think the political disputes, like, the disagreements between the two countries was something that tended to be more emphasized in the media or the popular, debates back in the days. So there was not much sort of, urgency that was shared among Japanese politicians or the public to have some sort of security coordination with South Korea. I mean, among the expert, like the policymakers that actually, or policymakers, bureaucrats that actually work on it, they probably have their passion towards that topic. But at a general sort of atmosphere, I think there's not much sense of urgency on Japan's side as well. So basically, a lot of these efforts for these two countries to have close security ties were come from the United States. Actually, the Obama administration was actually trying to facilitate close security ties between the two countries. It goes back to the earlier point that President Obama wanted to reduce the cost of security commitments abroad, and he thought that burden sharing, having allies do more, will solve that problem. So that's kind of the rationale behind the Obama administration, facilitating the security, better close security ties between two countries. You can see the 2015 agreement over the compromise issue, the SOMIA, but it just didn't, if the two countries didn't have that sort of shared sort of understanding that despite the different strategic priorities, we have something we have to talk about in terms of regional security. That sort of urgency was not present in both capitals back in the 2010s, and that sort of urgency is actually growing, emerging in both capitals. That's probably the reason that this is, the U.S. efforts for close security ties, finally bore fruit in 2023 actually. And and I think your first. Sorry, I didn't get your second question. Sorry, could you repeat that part?
Yes. So the second question is, how is Japan currently perceiving its bilateral security ties with Korea?
Okay. That's another. I mean, it's really hard to tell what the public is, how the public's seeing this. There's not much, of a strong reaction compared 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, both countries had a strong reaction when it comes to this bilateral ties, but it's more of a, some observers might argue that, citing the historical disputes that between these countries and how, South Korea, depending on the political leadership, these arrangements, agreements sort of just went up and down. That sort of, there is some, people do point out that the stability of this agreement going forward, but we don't really see a strong reaction per se. I mean, and when you think about the actual, actually the details of these, or what this, the Trilateral Security Summit tends to achieve, it's very technical when it comes to how to coordinate, missile defense and all of that. So it's very technical. So I think it's just more of a Japan's view towards this, at least in the public level, is very it's more quieter than probably 10 years ago when something that involves South Korea would have had a very strong reaction, probably on both sides, right? So now I think it's more of a quiet reaction, but people are just trying to see where this is going to go, be more observant than reacting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matsuda. This concludes our Q&A session. So now we will go into upcoming events very quickly. So the next Getting to Know Japan webinar is on roles of kinship and family in Japanese society. This is going to be next Tuesday at 10 a.m. Dr. Catherine Goldfarb will be our speaker for this event. So please join us for that event next Tuesday for Getting to Know Japan. Okay, the next Indo-Pacific Maritime Hour is going to be on September 20th. It's on Japan's ocean borderline or borderlands. Dr. Paul Kirkman will be the speaker for that. So if you are able to join us on September 20th, this is also an online event. Please join us for the next YCAP's Indo-Pacific Maritime Hour. The next YCAP's Indo-Pacific Dialogue is going to be on the heirs of NATO East Asia engagement. Dr. Ulf Hansen is going to be the speaker. This is going to be on September 22nd at 19:30. So if you are interested, please join us for this online event. And the last event is for community conversations. It's on civil military coordination on disaster relief operations of the Japan Self-Defense Force at home and abroad. This is an in-person event in Iwakuni. So if you are in the Iwakuni area, please join us for this event. They will begin at 17:45 with refreshments, and 18:30 the presentation will start. Again, this is going to be on Tuesday, September 26th. And Dr. Saya Kiba will be the speaker for this event. Finally, we have our Whitecaps YouTube channel. If you are not already subscribed to our channel, please subscribe. Please leave comments and please turn on your notifications so that every time we upload a new webinar, especially if you're not able to attend our webinars, you'll get a notification when we upload. So we thank you so much for your continued support with our Whitecaps YouTube channel, and we hope you will continue to look at it each week. So to conclude, I want to thank Dr. Matsuda for your presentation today and taking time out of your day to be with us. And once again, thank you to our program sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York. We really appreciate everyone who joined us today and for all the amazing questions. We hope to see you next week. Thank you once again for your time, Dr. Matsuda, and see you everyone. Bye.